Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gap between academics and marketing. Every other week, we sit down and go deep into the science behind how we can make great connections between brands and the people that buy them. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today we're sitting with Tali Sharot, author of The Optimism Bias, The Influential Mind, and a new book coming out at the end of February, Look Again, The Power of Noticing What Was Always There. Let's get into it. Tali, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands. We're very excited to have you. This podcast is dedicated to finding the best applications of behavioral science in the world and making sure that we explain not just the examples, but the why behind what we're talking about with our listeners. And before we get into our conversation today, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an intro. You're the author of 3 books, The Optimism Bias, The Influential Mind, and a new 3rd book that is coming out this February called Look Again, The Power of Noticing What Was Always There. You were also the speaker at a wildly popular TED Talk called How to Motivate Yourself to Change Your Behavior that has over 15.5 million views on YouTube right now. And today, you are the director of the Effective Brain Lab and a professor of cognitive neuroscience at University College of London and M.I.T. Welcome, welcome. We're thrilled to have you on the show today. And as is many things in life, our audience and listeners love to hear stories. Maybe you could start just with a little story about how you got introduced to behavioral science. How did you come to this field in the beginning?
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually a neuroscientist, but I do mix in psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. So I really kind of sit in the center. When I went to university and I was going to do my undergrad, I actually wanted to do it on neuroscience, but there wasn't any neuroscience program in the whole country. So I decided to do psychology, and I decided economics as a background. At the time, I didn't know about Kahneman and Tversky, but it was like their beginning. You know, they already had one book out, but it wasn't as well known. So it wasn't in my mind that I was going to put these two things together. But it turned out to be a very good decision. I did my undergrad in psychology and in economics with the intent always to then the next stage was to go ahead and do a PhD in neuroscience. And so I did. I went to NYU and I did a PhD in psychology and neuroscience, what you call it, like I call it cognitive neuroscience. And from there on, I think some of the studies that I did really, I mean, my PhD was on memory and emotional memory and traumatic memories. But then when I went on to do a postdoc, I ended up, maybe I can tell you the story. It might take a few minutes long. I don't know if you want me to go into it.
Yes, please.
Okay.
We're very interested.
Okay. So as I said, my PhD was on memory and how you remember negative events. I had a study on 9/11, memories from 9/11, because I was there at the time doing my PhD. So we asked people about their memories of that day and recorded the brain activity to kind of see what is special about those memories. They tend to be very vivid, very detailed. And we're interested in the neural mechanism that gives rise to this very vivid and detailed memories, which are, by the way, not necessarily accurate. So there isn't a tight correlation between how vivid memories are, emotional memories in particular, and how accurate they are. We bring them up again and again and again, and every time we can change the details. But anyway, I finished my PhD. I went to Harvard to do a short postdoc. When I got there, I learned that people were studying imagination, right? And I was thinking, well, it's really interesting if I ask the same question that I did about memory, I'll ask it about imagination. How do people imagine these very negative, traumatic events? So I started my study, and I was going to scan people in the brain imaging scanner while they imagine negative events. But what I found was that when I asked people to imagine these negative events, they tend to change them to positive events. So for example, I would say, imagine breaking up with your partner. And someone said, I broke up with my girlfriend, and then I found a better one. Or I asked even neutral events and said, well, imagine that you get a haircut. And the woman said, I imagine I went to get a haircut with all my friends and I donated my hair to Locks of Love. So it seemed that a lot of people, when imagining the future, they imagine it with these kind of very wonderful, like pixie dust, right, on top. And this was very frustrating because how am I going to study the brain mechanisms of how you imagine traumatic events if people are not imagining these traumatic events? Um, but then I thought, well, it's also really interesting. It took me a few months actually. I was struggling. I tried to change the questions and so on to try to get them to imagine these things, and it took me a while. But then I thought, this is quite interesting. What's going on? And that then led me to research literature and find this thing called the optimism bias, right? How we tend to imagine the future better than the past or the present. From there, that kind of led me to future thinking, planning, decision making, which I found, I have to say, much more exciting than memory. Memory is interesting, but I find thinking about the future and your decisions and what are the implications of those decisions to be really interesting. And although there was already research from behavioral economics, by that time, Kahneman was well known, not as much as he was later on with his book. But there wasn't a lot about really the mechanism, the cognitive mechanisms, right? The biology behind it. So it was really an open field, which was really fun to kind of like jump into.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Do you think that you've always had this type of interest in your life, or did you come into university with the plan that you talked about and that you then found this niche and that was how you got into it? Like, or did you always have an interest in memory first, and then when you found the opportunity for future thinking, what got you started on that?
Yeah, no, I wasn't necessarily interested in memory. I was interested in the brain. And I was interested in anything to do with the brain that tells us something about the self, about why you are the way you are, and to understand other people. The reason I ended up with memory simply because there was a terrific mentor at NYU and a professor that was studying that. So when I had to choose someone to work with, that was a good choice. And there wasn't anyone at the time actually doing decision making. So it was kind of, just a chance thing. Um, but I think, it's good to have a background, as people do, in these different domains that are very much overlapping, right? I mean, memory is going to be hugely important for the decisions that we make, obviously.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we've often found when we are talking about commercial applications of these academic principles is that, the reason people get interested in them come from wildly different reasons, whether it's your brain, being interested in brain science, or Richard and my background in commercially applying advertising and trying to find ways to make advertising more effective. But kind of no matter where you start, when you uncover the power of some of this science and then thinking about how to apply it, that's where it can get really exciting and interesting. Richard, maybe I'll hand it over to you and we can start chatting with Tali
Yeah,
about.
I think that's a very good place to head over. So, Tally, one of the things Michael and I are most interested in is the practical application of behavioral science, behavioral economics, cognitive neuroscience. Are there any examples you think of businesses or brands that have applied some of these principles very well, moved from the realm of the abstract to the practical?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with an example that I describe
Hmm.
in the new book, Look Again. So I was working with TUI, the tourism company. It's a large British tourism company. And they wanted to know, this was like my assignment, to find out what makes people the happiest on vacation and when they are happiest. So we did surveys, and I actually went out to these resorts. It's a nice project to have,
Nice.
to chat with the people. And what the data showed is a few interesting things. The first one was that people were the happiest 43 hours into their vacation. So why 43 hours? Well, that gave them time to settle in, right, and really focus on the fun. And from that peak point of 43 hours, the joy started going down and down and down and down and down. Now, they were still happy. Day 8, they're still happy, but they're not as happy as day 7, not as happy 7 as day 6, and so on and so forth. And we think the reason for this is habituation, which is what we talk about a lot in the book, which is habituation is basically our tendency to respond less and less to things that are the same or constant. So you go to this wonderful resort, and it's wonderful, right? But the view of the ocean, the pool, the food is great, is nicer the first time. And in fact, when we asked people what were the best bits of the holiday, there was one word that they used more than any other word, and it was first. Right, the first cocktail, the first view of the ocean, the first sandcastle that I built. So that was super interesting. And then TUI took all of that and came up with a few things that they could do. The first thing that they wanted to do is to make first salient. So, for example, they had a new cocktail and they named it the first cocktail.
Yeah.
So, kind of reminding people of those firsts. The other thing that they did is they wanted to stretch out the joy as much as possible. And they wanted to stretch it out even when people went back home. So what they did is they sent memorabilia to people's homes, including like a framed picture. So when people returned home, they then had these pictures, right? They could put it on the fridge. They had little things that reminded them of the holiday, to kind of extend the joy as much as possible.
That's a lovely idea. Because as you were talking about the most pleasant memories being at the beginning, that poses a massive problem for TUI. Kahneman and Radermeyer argue that it's often the final moment of an experience that stick in our memories 2 months, 3 months later. So if you're declining in happiness, when you're back into the market to choose a holiday and you're remembering those final moments, you might think poorly of TUI. So sending the memorabilia once they've got back is a brilliant way of kind of hacking those memories. That's a lovely example.
I think that's exactly right. And they also had, I think they tried to get people to sign up to their next holiday, right? And I think they did that before they even got back, like a little email saying, how about the next one? Yeah.
And did they manage to record whether those interventions were effective? Because they sound like they're based on very sound psychological principles, but did they translate into behaviour change for the visitors and tourists?
I have to tell you that I don't know. I hope they did. I often find that when I work with companies, they go ahead and implement the things, but often it is true that sometimes you get kind of like a follow up, but not always.
Yeah.
But that would be nice to know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Richard and I spend a lot of time talking about, it's a special type of brand leader, company leader that even wants to ask this question of what is the science behind it. But when it comes to making the decisions and sticking with it, human nature sometimes gets in the way. Even if these are the right principles, it's hard to stick with it for a long period of time. Even when you know that the right thing to do is to continue to test and learn, you find something that you just can't get rid of, like the first cocktail, and then you just want to stick with it no matter what happens next. So there's a bit of human nature that we're fighting when we're trying to design these things, regardless of what happens.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some marketers feel like if they measure things, then they might not work and therefore avoid it. But I think that is dangerously short term, because if you want the memorabilia idea to last forever and the first cocktail idea, you've got to be able to show data to support it. So next time the economy isn't quite so bright, the CFO doesn't take a red line to it. So yeah, I think there's a balance to be had.
Yeah,
so that's a lovely example, Tali. Are there any other brands that you've seen in the book where people have translated some of these academic ideas into practical approaches?
Yeah, maybe I'll give you an example from the last book, from The Influential Mind. So this is a health insurance company, Vitality. And Vitality is actually the first company that I went to speak at more than a decade ago. So my first kind of speaking engagement. So I remember them quite well. It was in South Africa. Now they work in the UK as well, and I think some other countries as well. But they are originally from South Africa. But anyway, they really, I think this is one of the companies that really use behavioral science the most, from what I kind of encountered. One of the really top ones. Okay, so what their goal is to get people to engage with more healthy behaviors, right? So that would be good for an insurance company, health insurance company. And so they used really interesting little in ways to get people to do that. So one thing they did is they have the system of points. So anytime one of the clients goes and buys food in the supermarket, they have a special card that they use, and they get extra points for buying healthy foods. Every time they go to the gym, they get points for going to the gym. Every time they go to medical screening, they get points for going to medical screenings. And all those points they could use them, the clients can, for actually for holidays, right? For little prizes, including holidays, which is also good for your mental and physical health. But they don't stop there. They have a website, and on the website, you can log in and you can see your points, right? And you can see your points going up and up and up and up and up as time passes. And also, you could see the points of the other family members and friends. So it could be a little competition, who's going to get the most amount of points. And I think there's a few principles here that they're using really well. The first one is immediate rewards. So to get to our goals, such as I want to be healthier, maybe I want to lose weight and so on, those things are things that we need to do now, but the benefit is usually in the future, right? I eat well now in order to not get cancer in 10, 20 years. I go to the gym to be fitter, but usually, I'll get into my jeans after going to the gym for a few months, not for a couple of days. And that's a problem because it's really hard to motivate yourself with rewards that are in the future. We know about temporal discounting. I'm sure your audience knows, which is we value rewards that are now more than rewards that are in the future. And so what's nice about that, they kind of put it, they said, okay, let us give you immediate rewards. You buy the apple immediately, you get the rewards. You go to the gym, immediately you get to the rewards. So they're really kind of taking that temporal gap and bridging it, right? And we know that rewards in general are very strong for motivating action. So that's one principle they use. The other lovely principle that they're using is this progress monitoring, right? When you see your numbers going up and up and up and up, that is extremely motivating, right? When you see you're getting better, that makes you want to act more and more and more, right? And the third one is social incentives, right? It's more fun when I'm doing it with other people, and a little bit of like friendly competition is always a fun thing to do as well. And I'm sure they're like, I know that they're still very much engaged with kind of, all the top behavioral. I always hear from my colleagues that they're engaged with them. So I'm sure they have many more things that they're implementing.
That's a lovely example. I thought the rewards part was particularly interesting. From your experience, are there particular types of rewards that work well?
I think they are. It's hard. Okay, so I mean, the most obvious reward, and actually, I would say anything with the word reward is rewarding. It probably means that it's going to work pretty well. But if you want to talk about the types, so you have the social rewards. Social rewards is feedback, right? So on social media, we use social rewards all the time. Those likes, those retweets, people telling you like, "Well done," those are social rewards. And prizes are maybe not. I mean, they're usually coming from other people. But I don't know if I would call them social rewards. The other is material rewards. I mean, material rewards work well as well. There's a lot of studies showing that if you pay people just a little bit to go to the gym to stop smoking, it works. So small amounts of money tend to work to motivate people to change their behavior. And what's interesting is that these social rewards, they could be even things like a smiley face. I often give this example of the electricity company that I use in Massachusetts. They actually send you a bill to show you how well you did on saving electricity over the year. And if you do well, you get a smiley face, and it's so satisfying to get a smiley face. And there is also an option to get 2 smiley faces, which is even more satisfying. And people love these smiley faces, right? I mean, they love those. It's a few reasons. One is we're actually wired to respond to a smile, to a face. We're wired to respond to faces in general, and we're also wired to respond to smiles. And there's studies showing that it takes really a minimal cue to have us respond to a face. Like eyes are enough to have a strong response in the brain. So even this little thing, the smiley face, is enough to get our reward system to be activated.
And you mentioned the positivity of financial rewards. Can there be some occasions where financial rewards backfire, where it might crowd out the internal motivation? Are there tricks that brands or businesses can use to avoid that problem?
I mean, there are studies showing some examples, and those constraints are examples which we can talk about in a minute. But I tend to find that those studies, the results tend to be quite messy. But there are, especially, I think the case with this is especially true, is when you are doing something because you really enjoy it yourself, right? So if you really, 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 really enjoy to go to the gym, there's probably not a problem, and I don't need to pay you. But the studies have been shown, like doing things for others, right? But even like, putting together, I think there was one where you put in like a Lego thing, and if you really enjoy it, then when you get paid for it, especially if the amount is small, that devalues the activity, right? But I think those examples when people are getting rewards are usually when these are things that they kind of like are not doing, right? But I mean, what's interesting also is that in some of these studies, when people and actually I have a great example, maybe I'll tell you about this example, but when people do get the rewards, material rewards, oftentimes it becomes a habit. So you don't necessarily have to continue with it for a long time. And it becomes a habit for two reasons. One is just a routine, right? Like I'm used to getting up, going to the gym at like 8 a.m. So it becomes a routine. But the other reason is people learn after doing for a while that they actually enjoy it, right? Because I learned that I actually enjoy eating an apple. And I learned I like to be in the gym, and more so, I like the feeling of being after. So after, you get through maybe the first time, it's not that enjoyable, but after a while it is, and it becomes a habit. And so then, from external motivation or external rewards, it becomes an internal motivation
So
and
the
internal reward.
financial reward is almost like scaffolding. At the beginning, it supports you until you build up that internal motivation, and then you can remove it. And hopefully, the internal motivation, the enjoyment of the gym or whichever habit we're encouraging, will sustain it. That's,
Yes,
I think,
but
great news for brands, because paying someone eternally is a bit worrying, but paying them for a short period of time, a couple of months, is much more of an opportunity.
right. But again, I don't think this would not be the case for things that are just not enjoyable. Like, putting out the trash. I don't think I'm going to be like intrinsically motivated to put out the trash,
Yeah.
or like household chores. But so I think there's these things where like, oh, there's things that you always like to do, like, I don't know, watching a show that you like, eating chocolate. And then there's things that like, some, maybe if you've done it for a while, then you appreciate it, or you become, you have like the hormonal response or whatever. So, and then you have things that probably you hate to do, but you just need to do them, like cleaning the dishes or whatever. Some people like, I don't.
Tali, can you help our audience bridge the gap with different types of categories of products? Like, for example, the health insurance and energy all make sense. Gyms, I can imagine how they can use this very easily. What about consumer product goods, like anything you find in a grocery store? If you're walking down the aisles, from detergents to cans of beans to boxes of pasta. How could a consumer packaged good brand potentially take this idea and maybe apply it to what they do? I don't know if you have any ideas on what they might think about.
I mean, so they already do some of these things, I'm sure. I mean, of course, you can sometimes buy something and then you get rewarded by something else,
A
as
loyalty
well.
program.
But trying to think about more these kind of high level concepts. So we talked about like memory, for example, right? But another thing that's related, which I kind of mentioned before at the beginning, is like imagination. And part of imagination is anticipation, right? You're imagining what is happening in the future. So a lot of things that we buy, whether it is a product, an actual material, or a good or a service, it often requires us to imagine what will be the consequence, what will be the outcome, how will we interact with it, right? And that imagination actually can be rewarding in and of itself. It's not only an evaluative act. I imagine the apple to figure out if I want to eat it, but I also might enjoy imagining eating the apple or imagining eating the cake. And so there are ways to actually make that more salient and use that. So I'm actually going to give you an example of not material, but then we'll try a material one. So
Sure.
here's a great example that's not a material good. It is Match.com, which is a dating company, right? And so often with these dating companies, what they're trying to sell you is a final outcome. Go online, find your one, get married, right? And so a lot of the ads or they show you like, oh, these people met online and now they're married and have a family. There's photos of the wedding and so on. But what Match.com did, and they did it, here's a problem with the outcome. It's like, how often is that going to happen, right? Most dates are not going to end up in marriage. So they are promising something that is very, very, very uncertain, and people can certainly get disappointed a lot. But what Match.com did, well, they said, okay, let me promise you something that I know almost for sure that you can get, which is the anticipation before the date, right? So they had images of people getting ready, putting on the lipstick, putting on the dress, putting on the suit, right? And putting on the music, getting ready for the date. And that in and of itself, that excitement and anticipation, that is a rewarding experience, right? The same thing with holidays, by the way. People, enjoy thinking about the holiday before they're even there. They already get the value while they're still sitting in their office. There's nice studies showing that as well. So that was a Match.com campaign. It was all about the anticipation, and it was like that was pretty much guaranteed, right? And people could not be disappointed about that. And I think with material goods, they do it, for example, with Amazon and packages, right? The excitement of I'm getting the package. I'm not opening it yet, or like I know that I'm going to get this package in 2 days. And it's not. I know that my kids for certainly are excited about that. But even one of my PhD students, we were talking about like an experiment that we're going to do, and he said, well, that is an example. He always gets really excited before he's getting the package. So I think it's adults, not just children. But that's something that you can highlight, right, in a campaign. The excitement of the package arriving with before it shows up, before you even open it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic area that isn't probably explored enough. The focus on anticipation rather than the end result, and it probably taps into a bit of your point earlier around hyperbolic discounting or present bias. That it's much closer to the state that you're in before buying the product than getting married or the actual holiday. 5, 6, 10 months away.
Absolutely. It's the immediate reward. The imagination is the immediate reward. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about, TUI, we've talked about Vitality and a few others. Could you give us one final example of a brand applying some of the principles you're most interested in?
Well, I did work with Prudential. What Prudential did, they had a series of ads. Some of the ads were on TV, some of the ads were just online. For each ad, they took a psychologist, and they had the whole ad around the psychologist's research, and the psychologist was like presenting, right, the main character. They have a great one with Daniel Gilbert, and where he's talking about, so it's all about most of these ads, I'll tell you about mine in a second, as well as Daniel Gilbert's, was about putting money into retirement, right? How do you persuade people to put money into retirement? And his was showing, if I remember correctly, it was something about like people had to literally show with like, I think it was a string, how much time they thought they had left, right? And how much money they had left. And he showed all these biases. People are misestimating how much money they're going to have at the end or how much time is actually left. The one that we did was really fun. So mine was the optimism bias. And so they did two things. One was it's this idea, right? Part of the optimism bias is our tendency to imagine the future better than the past and present. And one of the reasons for this is we tend to take in any good information about the future, really kind of take it in and change our beliefs. So if I tell you like, oh, 1 million people are going to listen to this podcast, you'd be like, oh, really? I wonder. And if I tell you like, oh, only 2 people will listen to this, you'll be like, she doesn't know what she's talking about. So we tend to take in the positive information about the future more so than the negative. And so we did 2 things. One thing that we did is there was, they had people in the office, just regular people in the office. They didn't tell them anything. And then they had a fire alarm go on. And they filmed these people sitting there, not doing, right, not moving, a fire alarm. You're like, it's probably fine, right? Probably okay. And then on another day, they had this kind of thing that sounded a little bit like an alarm. And it says, there might be donuts in the kitchen. There might be donuts in the kitchen. Everyone jumps out of their chair and goes straight to the kitchen. Because if it's, maybe there's a donut, I'm going to go see. But maybe there's a fire, I'm going to sit where I am. And then we did another one where they were coming in to listen to a talk. So I was giving a talk and they were coming in and listening. And then there was a break. And during the break, there was a vending machine. And the vending machine had a sign saying that it's not working. And yet, it said sometimes it's not working, something like that, right? Like uncertainty, like it doesn't always like work or it doesn't always give you your thing. And yet people kept, the video, there was like a hidden camera and it shows how people are in line and they keep putting their money in, kind of pressing the buttons, trying to get that chocolate bar. So the idea of that was optimism bias. We think that the negative events are probably not going to happen, and we don't do enough to try to protect ourselves. But when the positive things, we think, oh, yeah, that's probably going to be fine, and we act and we put effort into trying to get those.
Do you have any theories about why people have that optimism bias? Do you think this is a evolutionarily beneficial approach? What would you have an idea on that?
Yeah. So there is the negative effects that we talked about, which is if I'm too optimistic, I might not take preventative actions, right? And so I might underestimate my risk, and that could lead to a negative outcome. On the positive hand, if I have these positive expectations, first of all, it enhances my motivation, right? If I don't try to get that chocolate bar, well, I'm certainly not going to get it. If I don't try to get that donut from the kitchen, I'm certainly not going to get it. So it enhances your motivation to go out and try to get those things, a promotion, try to get love, whatever it is. Because otherwise, if you don't try, you're definitely not going to get it.
Yeah.
And the other thing is mental health. So there's a tight correlation between optimism and happiness, while pessimism is related to depression. In fact, it's one symptom of depression. So, imagining that the future will be bright keeps you mentally sound for obvious reasons. But there's a little trick that evolution has in store, which makes us really adaptive, which is we have the optimism bias when things are relatively safe. In relatively safe environments, we have it. However, stress people out and immediately they change how they take in information. They focus more on the negative. And now the optimism bias decreased and eliminates. We actually showed this. So we stress people out. We had one study where we brought students into our lab. We told them that they're going to have to give a talk in front of everyone else. We're going to judge them, record them, and put it on YouTube. And our students got really stressed. They said they were stressed. We checked their saliva. The cortisol went up and all of that. And then we did a task that we've done many, many, many times before. And people always show an optimism bias. They always learn more from the good than the bad. But when they were stressed, they started learning from the bad way more than they did before, right? So it's a little trick, which is in those situations where really we do not want to take a risk, right? The lions are coming your way, your heart is pumping, cortisol comes up. That's then changes the way that your brain takes in the information and makes you hypervigilant to the negative. And we can see that as well with public stressful events. When public stressful events happen, whether it's a terrorist attack or a pandemic, people start focusing on the negative, right? And sometimes they can become overly pessimistic, which then also leads to, that could also lead to overreaction in the market.
I think that's a really nice piece of research. around the variety. So how a different context leads to a very different importance of a bias. Is that an area you think that is being explored increasingly? Because we've talked about things like present bias, the hyperbolic discounting. Are a lot of those areas now being tested to see, well, when they are more prevalent, when they are less prevalent, which types of personality are impacted most? Is that something that you think is a growing area?
I don't really know. I mean, people are doing that to some extent. It's hard for me to kind of say
Okay.
whether that's a growing area or not. But we are. It is. There are studies like, about what do you do under stress, like age, how that changes with age, how does it change with any other demographical differences.
Oh, that's interesting. So, in terms of the optimism bias, how does it vary by age? Do we become more optimistic as we age, or less?
So
Tali,
optimism bias.
yeah, I was going to say in your TED talk you had a very interesting chart that connects to this. Is that right?
Yeah. So what we find is that optimism bias is quite high in kids and children, and then children and teenagers, and then it goes down, 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 and it reaches the lowest level in midlife, and then it starts going up again. And so, in fact, when you look at the elderly, their optimism bias is quite high, and that is the same for happiness. Happiness is relatively high in kids and teenagers, goes down, 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 rock bottom in your midlife, but then starts coming up again. And
Yeah.
in fact, despite it's counterintuitive, but happiness is quite high in people over 70 until the last couple of years of life. And
I love
if
that
you
research, by the way. I think I'm pretty much the nadir. I'm 48, so everything's just getting better according to that for me. So I'm definitely buying into that.
optimistic, yeah. And if you look at stress, it's the other way, right? So stress, it starts quite low in children and kids, and then it goes up, up, up. Stress reaches peak in your midlife. That's when you're taking care of children, professional stress, and taking care of elderly parents, and then it starts going down. So our hypothesis is that one reason, at least, is that this stress is what's causing the optimism bias to go down in midlife. Right.
One area we've had discussions about before is, at first glance, sometimes different biases seem to contradict each other. But then sometimes when you dig into them and look at the specifics, they're actually looking at slightly different things. So we've talked in the past about, I think it was Pratto and Feldman looking at the negativity bias, where if you give people long lists of words, some are positive characteristics, some negative, people tend to remember the negative more. Now, how would you explain when that comes into play, or maybe disagree with the research, and when does the optimism bias come into play?
Yeah. So the difference here is memory versus predictions. So for memory, despite the fact that people think, by the way, that negative, and that was my research, right? How does negative things affect memory and how it increases it? But in fact, the truth is that when it comes to memory, it's about arousal, not about valence. Arousing things are the ones that we remember the most. So it could be, the birth of your child or a wedding, or it could be a car accident or, 9/11. The reason it's more negative, it seems more that we remember more negative, is just those really arousing events are usually negative, but it's not the negativity that is causing memory to be consolidated so well. It is the
Okay.
arousal. But that's for memory. When you come to predictions about the future, because optimism bias is not about looking back, it's looking forward. For that, we see a positivity bias. And again, we see a positivity when you think about the future, when you imagine, right? That's why when I was looking, I was like, oh, let's look at memory. Same thing as imagination. No, it's not the same thing, right? There's different things that are happening when you look at the future. And again, it will be, as we said, it'll be different whether you're high stress or what age you are. But in general, you have the positivity bias more when looking at the future on average. And I would say an arousal bias is just that a lot of arousing events are negative when you look at the past.
I'm not sure if the arousal bias name is going to catch on as much.
No. The arousal effect.
Yeah.
Right. Tali, I think we could talk to you for another hour, but I know we're coming to the end of our time. A final question we love to ask all of our guests is there something that you're reading or watching that's captured your attention right now? Something that's got you thinking? We're always on the lookout for great things to consume, read, watch, listen to. Is there something in your life that you're enjoying right now that you'd share with everyone?
I just finished this novel, and it was fun. It's
Yeah.
also like supposed to be a good novel. It's called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, um, and it is about people who make video games.
Uh-huh.
But it's really, and so it's interesting because I don't know anything much about video games, but in fact that part was interesting. But the story itself is about relationships, right? And not necessarily romantic relationships. It's friendship, and so yeah, that's just something that I just finished now, and I thought was quite good.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I know we'll have people pick it up because of this, so that's wonderful. As we come to a close, look again. The power of noticing what was always there is being launched on February 27th, 2024. We encourage everyone to go out and grab a copy, and of course, Optimism Bias and the Influential Mind by Tali, all exciting, super great reads. Tali, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. That was fun.
Wonderful. Until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.